The reading today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 22 to 26. May we open our hearts to the reading of these words. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. No, there's another one. May we be granted wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Amen. And I want to thank all the adults and Sarah who stayed overnight as our youth were here for a retreat. And I know they had a wonderful time. A lot of things going on in the church this week. We also celebrated the marriage of Christy and Casey yesterday. That was wonderful. Okay, so World Communion Sunday. You know, growing up in a church where we celebrate communion every Sunday, I was always wondering, well, why is this Sunday any different? But it was first started at Shadyside Presbyterian Church in 1933. Dr. Hugh Thompson Kerr served as pastor, and he thought that it would be a wonderful way to acknowledge communion and for their community. It was a way to reach out to other congregations in the community, and they would all share communion on that day. It was really hoped that it would take off, but it really didn't take off. But the Second World War broke out. And all of a sudden, the churches were very concerned about a world that was being torn apart. And World Communion Sunday began to grow legs. In 1940s, the precursor to the National Council of Churches promoted extending the celebration to churches all over the world. And that is when it became this celebration that we celebrate, this day that we celebrate once a year. And it's important because World Communion Sunday is celebrated around the world, demonstrating that the church founded on Jesus Christ peacefully shares God-given goods in a world increasingly destabilized by markets based on greed. World Communion Sunday reminds us that even as we celebrate differently, it is at the table, ultimately, that we are bound to one another through Christ. And it's there that we are reminded that we are all guests. You know, Jesus' Passover meal was much longer than the one that we share each week because it was the Passover Seder. There would have been at least 4 cups of wine per person, food, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, prayers, and hymns. And the disciples must have been sort of confused when Jesus started talking about his body and blood and this new covenant, which harkened back to the prophet Jeremiah. But it wasn't something they could understand except in hindsight. So for about 1,000 years, the church went along and people were celebrating communion, but then the church became more of an institution. And then by 1215, believe me, this is going to speed up. Bishops started using this term transubstantiation. And it was a belief that during the liturgy, the saying of the words and the prayers, that the elements of bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. And this became the standard doctrine. And this theological doctrine influenced a lot of things. Architecture, for instance. Altar rails were created to make sure that wandering animals didn't just kind of come in and by chance eat the consecrated host. There was a great deal of wringing of hands, wondering what would happen if stray dogs ate the body and blood of Christ. So then, Martin Luther came along and there was a new idea called consubstantiation, which meant that the substance of the bread and the wine still exist, but the presence of Jesus is there. And then there was a slew of Reformation theologians, and there was Zwingli, who saw communion just as a symbol of God's grace and Jesus' sacrifice, and Calvin, who straddled this fence. And it was really confusing to me. And then there was a movement of radical Reformation and Anabaptists calling the sacrament an ordinance or a commemoration, of the event that Jesus had with his followers. And it was a participation in the suffering of Jesus, which brings us to this community. Communion is central to our worship. We gather at the table each week. It's a joyous act of thanksgiving for all that God has done, is doing, and in the creation within us and in the redeeming of all of creation. But as I was thinking about this and wanting to talk about communion, I realized that none of this history really helps any of us know about communion. And I don't like to tell stories about myself, but communion has been central to my life, and I don't know how to talk about it without telling you a few stories. Story one, I was a cradle disciple, and long ago, those of us who were not baptized yet could not receive communion. We passed the trays down the row until we were baptized into the community of Christ. And I have to say, it was a powerful experience to sit on the front row, a new soggy Christian who, in front of everyone, accepted the little tray of square bits of things that were supposed to be bread and drink a shot of Welch's grape juice and then place the little glass cup back in the special tray with its honeycombed top. But it's not that first official communion that I remember most. It was a special one when I was about 5 or 6. Our church's big Christmas event was a cantata, and it always took place the Sunday before Christmas. We didn't have Christmas Eve services, but one year, one of the elders, I think it was Ruth Alexander, wanted the church to offer communion on Christmas Eve, but nobody could agree on a time. The solution was to have the trays of the communion on the communion table by early afternoon and to leave them there by midnight. The door to the church was left open, lights were dim, and a couple of deacons popped in throughout the day and the evening to make sure the supplies were steady, and then they would finally turn off the lights and lock the door. We lived just up the street from this church. My dad worked on the assembly line of the Ford Motor Company. He was always exhausted. But on this night, he showered and put on his blue suit. I thought he looked handsome. My sisters and I dressed in the Christmas dresses our mother made, and Mama put on a dress and lipstick, which meant she was going out, and we walked to the church. We were the only ones in the church that time, and we walked into the sanctuary and up in the chancel area. Mama took the lids off the cups and the bread, and she passed the bread tray. When my sister passed it to me, I started to pass it to Daddy, and my mom said, "It's okay, Bug, you can join." Never was eating a tiny speck of something sort of resembling bread so exciting. I was also allowed to take the cup. Both trays back on the table, my mother replaced the lids, and I turned to go when my dad said, "Let us pray." I stopped and turned to see the rest of my family standing around the table and heads bowed in prayer. Daddy led us in a prayer of thanksgiving. It was the only time I ever heard him pray aloud in church. He always offered beautiful blessings at family gatherings and meals, but he was never invited to lead in worship. I learned later that his feelings had been hurt by not being asked, but he was timid. He was timid about being self-taught, about only having maybe a second-grade education. And because of that timidity, he never had the courage to approach the pastor or the elders to ask to be included. But on that Christmas Eve night, when my parents let me into their baptized fold, I heard my father pray in my sanctuary. My bone-tired, scrubbed clean, and dressed up dad lifted Thanksgiving that we were all together, that in that quiet night, we remembered how loved we were and that we were bound together, not just by blood, but by this meal. You know, when I turned 60, I turned into this, I can't watch commercials or anything, so I'm sorry. Story 2. Fast forward many years. I have 2 small sons, 3 and 6-ish. They were blonde-haired, blue-eyed sweeties. But this was early 90s Austin. And Austin has always been segregated, but it was even more so then. My son's preschool and their school were populated almost exclusively by white people. Their church was all white, and I couldn't stand the thought of them not being raised with people of different races and ethnicities. So I started a quest for an organically diverse church. It had to be of a denomination that would ordain women, and it needed to have communion every Sunday. And it needed to be within a certain driving distance. So that was a Rubik's Cube to solve. Our first congregation to visit was a vibrant church. The people welcomed us. They were warm. They were dressed to the nines. It was a sign of respect for the day and the act of worship. We were rumpled. And my sons looked weird because I let them choose their own clothes. The members' children sat still, and then they were gently reminded to sit up straight, to look forward, and to be quiet. Mine squirmed beside me and asked questions, complained about a wrinkle on a sock, and tussled over a bit of crayon that each one loved. And all was fine with this kind of gentle rumbling until communion was passed. You see, we'd been attending a church that, like United, had an open table, so everyone was welcomed. The baptized, the unbaptized, the questioning, the resolute. I kept my eyes open to see what others did. I wanted to respect the ways of the congregation. I saw that parents passed the trays by the children, and I noticed that no one under 12 or so was taking the bread or cup. So the trays came to our row. A beautiful woman with a hat held the tray for me, and we took the bread. The boys were between us. They started to reach for a piece of bread, and I said, "No, not now." Well, they withdrew their hands and looked at me. But then came the tray of cups, and we went through the same motions and commands. But then when I passed the tray of cups to the deacon beside me, the boys realized communion had passed them by. And my eldest, in that high voice that only people under 8 have, wailed, "Wait a minute, I want communion." And then my youngest, not to be outdone by his older brother, throws himself out of the pew onto the floor and begins sobbing because he hasn't had communion. And Austin, the oldest, looks at me with tears in his eyes and loudly says, "Can y'all do that? I thought Jesus said to share." The well-behaved children looked at us, but their mothers made them turn their heads right away. The deacons carried on with their sober duties, and my children squawked as if they were being tortured. And when it was clear that my family's lack of decorum had no end in sight, I picked up Ben, took Austin by the hand, and we walked down the center aisle with their sirens of disbelief and great sadness just hanging in the air behind us. Got him in the car. They're still wailing and wailing. Stopped at Wheatsville and I bought grape juice and a loaf of bread and some sandwiches. And at Mayfield Park, we spread a blanket inside of some preening peacocks and we had an impromptu picnic. But before we ate lunch, we had communion. I prayed, Austin prayed, Ben said something, but I wasn't sure what. And the bread and the juice that passed them earlier was now theirs to consume. I tried to explain that there were churches that didn't let everyone take communion until people were baptized. My boys were flummoxed, and trying to explain traditions, baptismal covenants, and Christian initiation to the under 6 set ultimately came down to an agreement that any church we belonged to had to be one where everyone could take communion. Because Jesus said to share. Third story. I worked with migrant farm workers in North Carolina. I was the North Carolina United Methodist Minister to Migrant Farm Workers. I drove all throughout the eastern part of Tennessee looking for camps in this big blue van that only had second and third gears. So I always had to go forward. Once I found the camps, I would connect workers with healthcare resources, dentists, and schools for their children and transportation. And if they wanted, I would provide worship services. One camp was comprised of just men. They were all people from the U.S., but their lives were marked by desperation and illiteracy, isolation, loneliness, and abuse. They lived in a big barn in which partitions had been put up so that each man could have a room. And the folks at this camp said that they wanted a worship service. They wanted it all. They wanted hymns, they wanted prayers, they wanted a sermon, they wanted communion. And so I made bulletins and I brought hymnals. And then we got to the night and they had set hay bales in a circle in the center of the barn, and rats scurried around on the rafters above us. A bale in the center of the circle served as our communion table. I opened with a hymn. I passed out our bulletins, and I announced the title and the listed number, and I waited for everyone to open to the correct page. And then I saw that some of the men had their hymnals upside down. And then I learned that some of them didn't know their numbers. And so I realized that I was going to have to pivot because a responsive reading was not going to work. How were we going to do that? We did, you just call and response. But I didn't know if people would know all the words to the song, so I just started singing. And others who knew the songs sang, and those who didn't hummed. And then we got to communion. I said the words of institution, I offered prayers, and then I told them how we would pass the bread and the cup. And one man said, as he got up to go, "You don't want me here." I assured him that this was the table of Christ and that there all are wanted. He hesitated, and then he sat down and he put his face in his hands and he just cried and cried. Sun-hardened, road-weary men who did stoop labor all day and slept in a rat-filled barn at night said their neighbors' names and looked them in the eyes and proclaimed redeeming love and grace. We ended the service with a prayer. The man beside me took my hand, and I raised my bowed head to see that all the men around the circle were holding hands, and the man who had previously held his tearful head reached out a hand for me, and I prayed. But when I finished my prayer, words of prayer were spoken by each man around the circle, and then we all said, Amen. I came back every week until they finished their work and moved farther north. I brought the hymnals and the orders of worship. Those trappings of a worship service were nice, but it was during communion that the workers ceased to be people that no one cared about or even cared to see. They became proclaimers of God's grace, and they expressed thanksgiving for all that God has done in the world and in them. For millennia, we Christians have argued over the right ways to serve and to take communion. We've spent countless years in theological debate on just how God's presence is known in the breaking of bread and the drinking of cup. And I know that I'm supposed to have a deep theological description of the ritual of communion, but all I can really say is that where two or more are gathered, there too is Christ. As a child on that misty Christmas Eve on which my father prayed as our family took communion, I learned that this ceremony was not reserved for those who run a church. As a young mother, I learned the power of a ritual that was shaping my children without me even really realizing it, and certainly not knowing how much it meant to them. As a young minister in the middle of a barn with sunburned sweet potato planters, I witnessed men sharing God's love, each one becoming more than what they thought and what they had been told they deserved. They did all this as they shared God's love with those with whom they worked day in and day out. On this World Communion Sunday, it is my fervent prayer that Christians across the world experience the intimate presence of Christ in their lives, that they know that this is a gift freely given and without reservation to them, and that we all will know with God's grace, we are blessed, we are loved, we are a part of God's beloved creation, and together, we can do as Jesus said and share. Amen.